All right, we'll go ahead and get started. It's about a minute after the hour. Here in California, it's 3 o'clock. I wanted to welcome you all to our online panel on Pacific Islander journalist profiles reporting in the Continental U.S. This is, of course, hosted by the Asian American Journalists Association and the Pacific Islander Task Force. Suzus Maasi, thank you for being here. We're so glad you can join us. And before we get to the panel, we wanted to do some housekeeping and introduce some members of the task force. First of all, this is a 1-hour event. We're going to have 45 minutes of moderated discussion with about 15 minutes for a public Q&A. This panel is currently being recorded and will be posted on YouTube and AAJA's platforms. You are welcome to turn off your cameras or change your names if you wish not to be recorded. We will be sharing the speaker's view of this presentation only. And now I wanted to talk a little bit about the Pacific Islander Task Force under AAJA. The Pacific Islander Task Force officially launched in May 2020 with 2 goals in mind. The first goal is to increase engagement, understanding, and Pacific Islander membership within AAJA. This is to ensure the organization fulfills its mission to serve all AAPI journalists by recognizing and uplifting Pacific Islanders. The task force aims to represent the indigenous peoples of Oceania, comprised of Polynesia, Melanesia, and Micronesia. The second goal of the task force is to develop tools to help journalists cover Pacific Islanders and Pacific Island communities to ensure fair and accurate reporting. Its founding members are Rachel Ramirez, who's on our panel today, Anita Hofschneider, who will be joining the call, Lauren Kawana, who is also on this call, and myself. With the support and consultation of new and veteran Islander journalists and the support by AAJA's national office, we were able to create the task force. If you would like to reach out to us, our email is pitaskforce.aaja@gmail.com. I'll be sure to put that in the chat for all of you who might want to get in touch with us. We look forward to hosting more events like this, both in and outside of the convention. Today's panel is part 1. In a few months, we'll be hosting a panel of Pacific Islander journalists reporting from Oceania. And without further delay, let's get started. I want to introduce our panel of extraordinary Pacifica journalists in the Continental U.S. First, we have Rachel Ramirez. Rachel is an independent journalist based in New York City, covering race, climate science, and environmental justice. She was born and raised in the Northern Mariana Islands. You can find her work in Vox, HuffPost, The Guardian, Rolling Stone, Grist, and more. Welcome, Rachel. We also have Katlyn Sophia Allo Alapati. She is a newsroom developer for the Chronicle. She builds pages and interactives that help Bay Area residents get the information they need. Before joining the Chronicle, Katlyn was the data reporter at Outlier Media, where she used housing records to get Detroiters critical resources. Katlyn received her bachelor's and master's degrees in communication from Stanford University. Welcome, Katlyn. And last but not the least, we have Lenika Cruz. Lenica is a senior editor at The Atlantic. She covers culture for The Atlantic, which she joined in 2014. She's also a volunteer editor with DC's Street Sense newspaper. She lives in Washington, D.C., and with her husband and 2 cats, and is an ube ice cream fan and BTS enthusiast. Lenica, welcome. So glad you can join us. And so with that, we wanted to open up the panel with this first question. Katlyn, Rachel, Lenica, tell us more about yourself and how you entered journalism. And I guess we can start in the screen order I have here with Lenica, Rachel, and then Katlyn.
Oh my gosh, I'm going first. This is intimidating. Thank you so much for having me, and I'm happy to be here. Like Sma said, I've been in DC here working at The Atlantic since about 2014. I started out as an associate editor and then kind of climbed the ranks. I've been on the culture team the entire time I've been there. I'm now a senior editor, and I mostly edit staff and freelance stories, but I also write sometimes. I used to write a little bit more when I first started out. I would write about like Game of Thrones and Mad Men and do reviews and interview people. But now I'm pretty much firmly in like the editor space. And then kind of my journey is now when I can talk about just kind of how I got into journalism and everything. Is that fine? Yeah, so I went to UCLA, and like a lot of folks who get started in journalism in college, I did a lot of internships. I divided my time between Guam and LA when I was a teenager. And after I graduated high school, I did internships at Guahan magazine, which no longer exists. And I freelanced for Pacific Daily News, which is also in Guam. But when I was in the States, in California, going to UCLA, I worked for the college newspaper. I didn't major in journalism because UCLA doesn't have a journalism program, but I did the college paper, and I just kind of found myself in the culture space. Being in Los Angeles, you're kind of right next to the entertainment world, so that was kind of an obvious thing to pursue. And then, yeah, I eventually, I've stuck with editing and found I really liked it. I initially wanted to be more of an investigative reporter, but found myself really enjoying doing culture.
Thanks, Rachel.
Yeah, so currently I'm a reporter with Vox. I cover race. I'm with the race and identities team, but I'm also a freelance journalist, so you can see my work in other places like The Guardian and the HuffPost. But before that, prior getting into the climate and environmental justice beat, I was in the business beat. I was with the Dow Jones News Fund business reporting program and with the Financial Times. But how I started really, I guess, informed my current beat now, which is environmental justice and climate, because I started in college in freshman year. And at the time, I was a big advocate for, more coverage of Pacific Islands and just like, the climate disasters, environmental disasters that are happening in the Pacific Islands. I remember going back home freshman year of college, visiting my parents and my friends and family, and then going back to Portland. I went to University of Portland, and then a huge typhoon struck the island, like literally a few days after I got back to Portland. And there was like, this was Super Typhoon Soudelor. It was, I think, in August 2015, Tomas, if I don't know, fact check me on that. But I remember going back, getting back to Portland and, immediately losing contact with my family. And that was when I was, scouring social media and news coverage, and finding no news coverage on what's happening on Saipan. I think it also sort of touched Guam, but it was mostly like the scene in Mai. And then I think a few days later, that was when I got coverage when the typhoon, because usually the trajectory of the typhoon hits like anywhere in the mainland Asia. So once it hit Taiwan, that was when the typhoon got coverage in CNN. So that was when I was like, okay, I want to do journalism. I want to uplift more stories in the Pacific Islands. And like Lenica said, like a lot of journalists, we sort of start off with internships during college, and I worked for local news publications in Portland, Oregon, and then found AAPI, which was really where I kickstarted a lot of my connections and networking that brought me here to New York now. And now I'm covering climate and environmental justice. So going back to, how I was sort of born into this industry.
Thank you. Katlyn?
Hey, I'm going to apologize in advance if my internet is spotty. I'm having some trouble with it today. But how I entered journalism, full disclosure, we got these questions ahead of time. So the more I've been reflecting on it the past few days, I think part of it is, like, in summary, wanting to try something and feeling like you're out on a limb, and then having someone surprise you by believing in you is basically how I ended up in the position that I'm in. And I think that that's probably true for a lot of folks. But I mean, I started off in journalism in high school, and I thought it was a lot of fun, and I thought it was engaging. And then I went to college, and I thought I needed to provide for my family eventually. So I decided that I was pre-med, obviously. And then all of a sudden, I decided that my happiness was worth something. So I made a hard pivot toward the end of my undergrad career, and I found a great department in comm. Like Lenica said, we didn't have a journalism program. So that's what I studied. And then I decided that I needed more time with them. So I stayed on for a 5th year. And every step along the way kind of felt like I would try something new. So even just leaping from bio to journalism, and then realizing that my brain doesn't have to be labeled or tucked neatly into a compartment that I could only write. So I decided to try developing, and did a project that got me a fellowship at ProPublica. And then it took me wherever I was interested. I followed it with some intention, and that a lot of good fortune followed. And I ended up on the news development team at the Chronicle.
Thank you all for sharing. I feel such a deep gratitude to share this space with you, especially as Pacifica journalists. Our next question, at the beginning of the event, I mentioned that one of the task force's goal is to increase engagement, understanding, and awareness of the Pacific Islander members within AAJA and Pacific Islander journalists overall, wherever they may be in the world. I wanted to ask anyone who's able to answer the question, how has your Pacific Islander identity impacted your newsroom experience in or out of the field?
I can go first, but my thoughts, I feel like, aren't, as cohesive as they should be. But I think, being born and raised in Saipan, Northern Mariana Islands, and just being surrounded by like such diversity and like culture and traditions, and being rooted in that, I think really helped me see and cover the stories that I cover with different lenses. And so when I cover environmental justice now, like I feel like I approach my stories with that type of lens of like seeing things, seeing things that I feel like the dominant Western gaze wouldn't see, if that makes sense. And so that's sort of how I approach most of my stories. And I cover communities that range from like Asian America, Pacific Islander communities, and also Black and Brown communities, and how they're impacted by industrial pollution and climate disasters and all of that. And there's a lot of things that I feel a lot of like compounding injustices that are built into sort of the fabric of why that happens. And as I mentioned before, my previous beat was business, and I was in a very predominantly white newsroom here in New York at the Financial Times, which is sort of my first job out of college. And I know the business beat is sort of white dominated, and so being around a lot of like white British men who has been there for 10 to 15 years or so, and being, the youngest woman of color in the newsroom, really spoke to how sort of they approached me in the newsroom and how they approached my story ideas and my pitches. And I remember one time, and this goes back to another typhoon story, but I was in the Financial Times newsroom when Super Typhoon U2 hit in 2018. And Super Typhoon U2 is like, and I know Lenica wrote a really good story on this, on media coverage, and how, it's the strongest typhoon that hit U.S. soil since 1935, I think. But the like dearth of coverage at the time it hit was like real. And I remember pitching the story to the Financial Times, and I just flat out got ignored. But I think, as a Pacific Islander, as an Asian American, you sort of know these stories that are happening in our homes and where we were sort of born and raised, and we see things from different lenses. And so coming up with these story ideas and having that tool is really important, especially for me as in environmental justice. And so I think convincing your like editors is also the hard part into that, and having them see the importance and significance of a certain story. But I think that's how, I guess, my identity, my PI identity has impacted me personally and professionally, having to work hard for editors to see, and other audience to see the significance of a certain story. But also, being able to see things in different lenses as other reporters.
Yeah, I would like to touch on what you said just a moment ago, Rachel, which is like it's hard to demonstrate significance. And I think that this has to be a shared frustration when we're talking about being an ethnic minority of minorities, you know, that we're even just battling to have data collected in a meaningful way. And I think that has colored my approach to pitching and pushing back on an editor's pushback, which is that I don't want to have to show you that this is the worst thing that has ever happened to any, you know, particular group by certain parameters. You know, I don't want to write you a lead that blows you out of the water for you to understand that this affects people. And it really has changed the way that I interrogate data, which was really essential to my work early on, and understanding, like, when we are reporting on communities based on data that's readily available, what a disservice we do to them by not basically challenging the readiness, the availability of certain data, and making sure that we represent whatever issue that we're talking about, whether it's education or housing, and really talk about not just what's there, but what isn't, and why that's a disservice to the people who we're writing stories about. And I think sort of focusing on the negatives, and I don't mean like positive versus negative, like good, bad, but the missing, the voids in the data sets that we're analyzing in order to tell stories. That's something that's always in the back of my mind. And I think it is 100% attributed to being an Islander.
I'm so happy that both of you went first, because you're just, I feel like I wish I had a space like this when I was starting out in journalism. I think a lot of times if you don't have a community built in, or if you don't already know journalists from you know where you are from, or like people to guide you, it can feel like you're the only person, especially if you're on the mainland in a newsroom without other Pacific Islanders. And so it's easy to decontextualize yourself and just force yourself to decontextualize yourself. You're just like, it's easy for us to kind of group ourselves in with more broadly, but then you have these experiences as journalists that remind you of the very unique lived experience and perspective you have to offer. And for me, for a lot of my coverage in the culture space, because I'm at a national publication, you're focusing on really mainstream stuff. And I didn't really feel like I was bringing my, you know, perspective as someone who grew up in Guam to my work until the first time was when North Korea announced in 2017 that it was going to be, you know, firing ballistic missiles at Guam. And I was in this newsroom where nobody really understood how to take that. And nobody was from Guam. A lot of people didn't know what Guam was, just like for the most part in the US. And it was just so frustrating. It's like, you don't want to have to be the one to jump in, because this isn't my beat. I'm not a international affairs person or politics person. I'm like, you know, covering pop culture. But it felt like I was in a bit of a pressure cooker where I was like, okay, if I'm not going to do something, even though I'm not an expert at this, I'm still the person who knows the most about this in my entire newsroom. And so I jumped into writing a story, basically calling folks on Guam and asking them, like, kind of getting the picture from the place that is being affected, because so much of the mainstream coverage was about like, what is Guam? Who are they Americans? What are, like, you know, and a lot of the focus was on the military, and it felt like the people who were actually being affected were being erased from the conversation. And so I didn't feel like I was the most qualified to do it, but I was like, this is what journalists do to an extent. We just report stuff out. We find out what we don't know. We try to contextualize. And so I wrote this piece, and I felt really proud that as someone who is, you know, Pacific Islander, that I could contribute something that I hadn't seen elsewhere, really. I mean, there were a few pieces There are some folks from Guam who are at the Washington Post, but for the most part, it just felt like I wasn't reading the stories that I wanted to, as someone who knows this this place intimately. And so that experience was repeated again a year later, 2 years later, with Super Typhoon U2, and that was another instance where I felt like I was waiting to see a certain kind of story, and I just wasn't seeing it. It was mostly either, if it wasn't covered at all, it was about how this typhoon was affecting mainland Asia, and then I was just like, but people are suffering. People have lost their homes. People have died. Like, why are we not seeing this? Like, and then to Katlyn's point about why do I need to demonstrate significance? Why does this have to be the worst thing to happen? Why do I have to tell you that these people are Americans for you to care? And so I'm grateful, I guess, that I have been able to reflect on the blind spots of newsrooms and to be able to rectify those in certain ways. But it just feels like there shouldn't have to be a lot of us in order for people to care. So yeah, that's kind of, even though my identity isn't a huge part every single day of how I think about my coverage, I'm just grateful for folks like you that you're out there answering these questions, asking the questions, and creating this space as well.
Can I also, I guess, add something very small that I guess has sort of been a pet peeve too when writing about stories of the islands? Is something that, like, you know, when I wrote a year story or a year aftermath after Super Typhoon U2 story, I literally had to like explain in almost like the lead before the nut graph, like where Saipan is, and sort of, you know, catering to, I guess, that, like I said, the larger Western gaze. And so having to explain like the colonial history of the islands again and again, and what comprises the islands, and that it's a U.S. territory, and that we're U.S. citizens, but we can't vote, but we can still join in the military and all that. Like, I think that has sort of been my growing pet peeve, and having to explain it in like 1 or 2 graphs because an editor wants me to explain it high up in the story.
Thank you all for sharing that. I think that segues well into the next topic. A lot of the complexities that you talked about experiencing. I wanted to ask, what are some of the stories you've worked on recently? And maybe adding on to that, given what was just said, how you've grappled with the experiences that you've had, and maybe even how that has changed amid the pandemic.
I can go first too, but I think the most recent story that I can think of is Vox put out a big Black History Month package on rethinking policies for Black America, and I wrote the environmental justice policy piece of it. And so, you know, writing it mostly focused on like Black communities, and I focused on a Black community in Louisiana, which is right smack at the heart of Cancer Alley. And they call it Cancer Alley because it's 7 out of 10 of the U.S. Census tracts, according to the EPA, has the highest cancer rates in the nation. So that's why it's called Cancer Alley. And this town that I focused on, St. James Parish, a predominantly Black community, has been fighting this petrochemical facility. It's a $9.4 billion petrochemical facility, a Taiwanese company that's about to set up shop right in their backyards. And so that's going to add pollution into their communities, even though that they already have like a, you know, mammoth or like a vast amount of industrial presence in their backyards. And, you know, it's sort of an intentional thing when you think about redlining and sort of segregation. It's an intentional sort of setup for industrial companies and facilities to intentionally set up shop in communities of color, particularly Black communities. So the story was essentially, you know, coming up with policies that would, you know, eliminate those, I guess, quote unquote, legacy pollution that burdens Black communities. And I came up with, you know, marrying the National Environmental Policy Act with civil rights protections. And I guess I'm really proud of that, because I also just heard today in our morning meeting that it's currently making rounds in the EPA, so I'm proud of that. And I don't think like it's, you know, I guess the impact of that story is huge. But one thing that, you know, I guess I've been fighting for, I think Tomas, I told you about this a little bit, is that, you know, I've been covering more of like stories of, you know, Black and Latino communities, but I don't identify with those communities. What I want to cover more is, you know, Asian American stories or Pacific Islander stories. But, you know, I think that the need for that in newsrooms is sort of like lacking, which is especially now with like the anti-Asian racism and xenophobia that's rising. And I feel like the urgency for those coverage is so needed. But I think like that should have been, you know, a coverage that happened in the beginning of the pandemic, when a lot of Asian Americans are getting called like racial slurs. And when we're seeing Pacific Islanders disproportionately dying of COVID-19, but because of the lack of data, and because oftentimes we're, you know, aggregated or lumped under the AAPI umbrella, that often gets lost in translation. And so those sort of like, I don't know, obstacles in reporting and the lack of data, which Katlyn like alluded to earlier, which is super important, is an ongoing struggle. And it goes back again to the pitching. If we don't have the data, how do we like, you know, how do we put together a story that fully captures the problem? But yeah, I think I answered the second part of the question, but I want to hear other people's thoughts.
And also feel free to just share a story that you're recently proud of that some of the audience members can look to as an example of your work as well. Lenica or Katlyn, did you have anything to add for this?
Yeah, I'm glad, Rachel, that you mentioned kind of this climate that we're seeing now, well, for the last year with anti-Asian sentiment, anti-AAPI sentiment. And it's hard because, like you said, all these different, very distinct and diverse groups that fit under that umbrella are aggregated together for better or for worse. Like, I know solidarity is really important, especially in newsrooms and in general among like people of color. But to your point about wanting more coverage of those issues, like again, like I said, in my space, in the culture space, a lot of times talking about race is like the best way to do that is to talk about representation, the stuff we see on screen in Hollywood. And this, the piece actually that, because I'm an editor, I'll talk about something I'm editing now, and I won't give away too much of it, but there's a piece that we're running soon about basically how the awards, Hollywood awards, like the Oscars, the Golden Globes in general, tend to overlook Asian actors, even when they are appearing in critically acclaimed films. So you have Parasite, Slumdog Millionaire, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, and just like all these different examples. And then most recently Minari, which won last night the Golden Globe for foreign language film, even though it is very widely described as, you know, an American story, but because Korean is the predominant language spoken, it is slotted into foreign language. And so this piece, we know, even if you know that Asian actors tend to be overlooked, and even if the films that they're in tend to be widely celebrated, the piece kind of breaks down like why that is, and how a lot of the racist myths that pervade society about Asians and Asian Americans, how that also has played out on screen in cinema over decades. And it's all very subtle, but I think it's important to still do the work of showing like how the stuff that you consume, the stuff you grow up with, the stuff you take for granted, all adds up to this broader environment in which, you know, Asians can be attacked and still not be covered and are essentially invisible. So that's the timing of the piece. You know, originally, like the piece doesn't talk about explicitly about hate crimes and doesn't go into that, but it feels very much like it's in conversation with what we're seeing right now.
I know we have to move through the questions. I will say that what I'm hearing a lot of is this general like frustration with the idea that well just broadly with the decisions, which are editorial, as to whose pain and suffering is newsworthy, and whose pain and suffering matters, and just the idea that we are constantly trying to have to prove that someone's trauma is statistically significant in order for it to be significant, is one that we're up against a lot. One piece that I worked on last year when I was still at Outlier in Detroit was with the Trace, which was a great collaborative piece and was a relatively easy lift. The thing that I really appreciated about that, it was a piece about as we went virtual early on in the pandemic, it was about women in particular who were seeking protective orders from their domestic partners, and how bottlenecked that process was, and whether they were able to seek the resources that they needed, even as, you know, the nation and the world was experiencing a very apart crisis. And what I will say about that is, at no point did any editor ask me to demonstrate that this was in some way worse in Detroit than in anywhere. You know, that wasn't the story. And what I really appreciated about that collaboration was that by working together, we were able to tell a story that certainly underscored the newsworthiness of pain and suffering, and it didn't question the legitimacy of it. Yeah.
And so with all of the experience and stories and reporting you've shared, I wanted to ask, I noticed a few young AAPI journalists in the audience, and what's your advice to aspiring young Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in this field?
I guess I can go first, since I've been letting others go first. I guess I would say, I mean, the fact that you're here is amazing. Like I said before, I wish I had a space like this when I was first starting out, but I did try to connect with others, you know, social media, through Twitter, people who, even if their beats are different from you, like connecting with people who are who can relate, who come from the similar background, and you can just kind of be there for each other, like whether or not, you can even reach out to, like, please email me. I think finding mentors is really important, mentors and mentoring others. And like, you are significant. You're one person, but you can like make these connections. You can, you'll never know. Like I met Rachel and Tomas when I was at AAJA, but we had connected in different ways, like online beforehand. And it's just like amazing to me. So much has changed since we met, but we are still here and talking and just, I think that's important, just maintaining loose connections, reaching out. And then I would say the other thing is pursue what you're interested in. I think a lot of times, because journalism is so competitive, it is a very hard industry to get into and stay in. And one thing that the industry is trying to reckon with right now is diversity, and is trying to, well, they say that they're trying to deal with it right now. But it can be really easy to see your background as something that distinguishes you, and that you want to lean into as something that sets you apart from others. And it's true, it does set you apart. But if you're not interested in writing about race all the time, that's fine. You know, look for the stories that you want to tell. Find people who fit that, who know a lot about that, and pursue it. I guess I would just say, don't box yourself in, but at the same time, I don't know, be proud of who you are, where you're from. And it's harder when you're first starting out to really feel like you can own your identity and your unique perspective, and be afraid to speak out. I would say, if you're starting out, try to find people who can be allies for you. And then if you are in more of a position of power, to help lift other people up. I realize this is all kind of basic, but this is basically what I've done. And yeah.
Thanks for that, Lenica. Katlyn or Rachel?
I would say that don't be afraid to ask for what you want. And that can mean a lot of things. But I think we often forget to sort of flip the script and think about how you would interpret a request if it were made to you. And often the things that we ask for, we would know how to say no to if really we couldn't offer it. And there's no offense and truly no convenience. Like one thing I can think about in particular is asking, my names are very complicated. I have 4 names, and I like to use all of them. And if people don't want that, that's a shame because they're my names. And I also talked about this a little bit before this chat, but I changed the pronunciation of my name. I don't actually know how to pronounce some of my names because the folks that gave it to me aren't around. And I think you undersell yourself, and it's almost like I mean, it's like it's a know your worth kind of message, but whether it's compensation, like asking for a relocation money, or whether it's asking, correcting someone with the pronouns that they use with you, or advocating for a colleague, like ask for the team that you want and be completely complicit in making that a reality. And sometimes you'll be asked to take less. Sometimes the answer is simply going to be no. And then you just have to reevaluate and ask yourself, are you okay taking less? Are you okay not getting to do the stories that you want in the way that you want to do them? And then you go from there. But ask for what you want.
These are such great advice. And I think going back to, how I started, I was also hoping for a direction. And so having a space like the Pacific Islander Task Force, I wish I had the same sort of group of people to lean to. And so having this task force, I think really helps. And joining it, I think, as we're fostering the task force, I know that we want to grow Pacific Islander presence and in the journalism industry. And so I think having this at the back of your mind would be really helpful, because I remember I also didn't have a J school. And so I was a communications major. I was also, taking a lot of environmental studies or environmental science classes. And I joined our student newspaper, which was predominantly white, which is, unsurprising. It's Portland, even though it's a liberal city, it's still predominantly white. And I was really looking for a place where I see myself. And that was when I found AAJ literally through Googling. And I went through my first conference and I joined their Voices program, which is sort of their summer, fellowship program where you work on a project and you're assigned mentors. And that was when I really got, introduced to the mentorship and mentees type of concept or world. And that really helped me out throughout the course of my career. And, just echoing what everyone said, just finding those connections and those network and finding and learning to find what's right for you in terms of your beats and in terms of what you want to cover. And I'm always also happy to chat with folks if you need someone to talk to about the industry, because I know I've always wanted someone to talk to before when I started out. And I know it can be intimidating, and so always happy to do that.
Great, thank you so much. I'm sure a lot of people are happy to hear from you all and know that you're open to speaking with them. I wanted to bring the conversation out a little bit and ask you all about what your suggestion might be to newsrooms in terms of hiring more Pacific Islander journalists to cover their communities, and maybe even expanding the range of beats at the outlets to include Pacific Islander communities. Whoever wants to start with that one.
I guess I would say this is something that's been front of mind for me, is I've been seeing so many newsrooms, leaders and stuff like that saying we care about diversity. And I feel like on all fronts, it's fine to care about diversity, but you need to spend money on diversity. And if you're saying that you care, you can't, like, you need to give people what they deserve. And if that means like going out of your way to find freelancers who are from the communities that you want to cover, and just like, it takes work. I feel like a lot of times you see newsrooms assigning editors who just want to either pay the least amount, run one piece about a story or community, and then that's kind of it. It takes a lot of investment, and I guess yeah, that's kind of the main thing. It's a simple thing, but yet so difficult. And I feel like it also, I think newsrooms need to go out of their way to recognize that a lot of times folks coming from the islands are not going to be coming right out of a J school. You might have to look a little harder, look to AAJA, and just kind of be willing to hire people, again, to cover any beat. Like, they don't have to be writing specifically about race, and you'll reap your rewards in other ways. Like, people, again, shouldn't have to prove their worth to you. Just like, respect the diversity and like kind of the uniqueness of each journalist you hire, and just kind of don't treat them differently than you would a white journalist.
I think this also goes back to, you know, the AAPI umbrella, and just, again, reiterating that not all Pacific Islanders are Asian Americans, and that there are Native Pacific Islanders in islands within Micronesia, Melanesia, and Polynesia that I think often gets lost in translation. So I think a lot of like hiring managers often think, when they think like Asian American, Pacific Islander, or AAPI, they immediately think of the AA part and not the PI part. And so I guess that speaks to, you know, changing your recruitment process. Like Lenica said, where are you finding your journalists or folks to apply for jobs, and also and then another part is also training, providing training or mentorship programs, and elevating Pacific Islander voices again, and not excluding them and ostracizing them in a way. And then the third part is, I guess, also funding, helping fund, you know, I guess resources, internship resources, travel costs to attend conferences. I think things like that are different ways to help boost Pacific Islander presence in the media industry. And I think Lenica touched on, you know, even if that requires hiring freelancers there. And I think that really speaks to, you know, how to revamp your whole like outreach and engagement model within your company or business as a hiring manager. I guess be creative. And I think there's this, you know, huge misunderstanding. Like, a lot of people, I guess not misunderstanding, but, you know, we always say that the U.S., the continental U.S. is a growing like multicultural country, but we often forget that Pacific Islanders and Native Hawaiians are like a huge part of that. And we're always like, a huge chunk of that population is always almost forgotten in the narrative and coverage and in the media. And so just remembering that.
Katlyn, would you want to jump in before we open up to Q&A?
Yeah, I would just say one thing is that it takes time. And it's not, like, money is certainly needed, but it's not something that money can just be thrown at. I remember going to a conference that was held by a large tech organization that shall remain nameless. And I approached one of the organizers because they asked for feedback, and I was like, happily will do. And I was like, have you noticed how white everyone is? And he said, yes, that was not our intention. We deliberately tried to not have the demographics of this be so starkly white. And he listed a lot of the sources where they sent out invites. And one of the ones that he named was an organization which I happen to know the board had just come under fire because all of them were white. And they had, the short of it is that it felt like the normal practices that you would incorporate into your reporting, where you're investigating and you're picking up the phone and you're calling people. And I could have named, 5 organizations that should have been invited, 5 newsrooms, because it was focused on local news. I could have named them and none of them were invited at all, because they were excluded from the organizations that had these listservs, right? And so it is a bunch of systems and institutional problems, and it takes so much more than just an email blast to listservs, because if they are already exclusive, then you're just really just propelling the lack of diversity forward. And so, yeah, it does take, that good old fashioned get out your phone and shoot emails to people, not just lists, and ask people who know more than you do what they should do or what they would do. So, yeah.
Thanks, Katlyn. Sounds like more shoe leather reporting needs to be done with that process.
Yeah, absolutely.
Really appreciate it. That's all the questions I have. I received some questions privately. I did want to open the space, though. I mentioned just a few minutes ago. Feel free to drop your questions in this chat. If you don't want to message it publicly, feel free to directly message it to me. Also, if you'd like to speak out or read out your question, virtually raise your hand on the Zoom function and we can unmute you to read out your question. We'd love to hear some voices other than our own. So I have here the first question submitted to me. Given the dearth of ethnic media for the PI community on the continent, what do you recommend for navigating media spaces? Is it getting existing spaces to be inclusive of Pacific Islanders, or investing in building our own media infrastructure? Great question, and thank you to the person who submitted that.
Tomas, can you repeat the last part of that question?
Sure. So what do you recommend for navigating media spaces? Is it getting existing spaces to be inclusive of Pacific Islanders, or investing in building your own media infrastructure?
So I would say it has to be both. Some ships have too many holes to patch on or patch up, and you don't need to be on it when it's sinking. But it's also true that if we were to do away with every structure and institution that was built by someone who didn't deserve the power and resources to build it, or one that only further marginalized communities that we care about, then there would be very little left, right? And so some of it has to be working inside to sort of remodel the structures as we know it. But in order to do that, often in order to convince, especially legacy folks who have seen no other way, there have to be the trailblazers that create something that we can refer to. So I'm thinking of places like Oakland Side, places like my former employer, Outlier Media, that show that journalism can be, newsrooms can be something different, something that actually work with and for their communities, and value diversity in a way that is not superficial.
I'm still forming my thoughts, but I think I'm also questioning like what the person means by media infrastructure, because I think it also depends if it's news companies or an organization like AAPI. I think those are completely different things. But I think also with the, I guess, against the backdrop of, renewed calls for racial justice and, going through this whole like racial reckoning all of 2020 last year, and a lot of newsrooms sort of dedicating themselves to, you know, committing to diversity and inclusion and being allies. I think like if I think that like elevating Pacific Islander voices and also helping, you know, I guess catapult that trajectory to make Pacific Islander presence in the media happen is important. And as you can tell, like we're talking a lot about like not having enough Pacific Islander presence in the journalism industry, and because of that we don't have like the resources to sort of, you know, create our own entire like quote unquote like media infrastructure. And so we need the help of like other allies and other like media organizations to help make that happen. And like Katlyn said earlier, like it takes time for, you know, those things to happen. It doesn't just like happen overnight. But I think with you know, against the backdrop of this like racial reckoning and new commitments to diversity and inclusion, I think being an ally and providing those resources and spaces like what we're having now, AAJ allowing us to have the space to talk about Pacific Islander coverage and Pacific Islander presence in the media is really important. And I think it's just like, you know, a stepping stone to what's to come in the future or near future. Yeah, I think that's all I have to say.
Lenica, did you want to jump in? We have a few more questions, but I wanted to give you.
No, we can move on.
All right, great. Thanks, Rachel and Katlyn, for that. The next question, this member wants to know, if you had 6 months to do your own investigative story, what would it be?
I don't know if I want to share it.
I was going to ask if it came with the funding to do it, but yeah, the question's up for anyone who wants to share.
Sorry, I was muted, but I would definitely do, and I'm not going into specifics, but one thing I've always wanted to do is like an environmental justice sort of series in the Pacific Islands with a focus on military contamination in the Pacific Islands, and how the U.S. have always like worked to cover up all those like legacy of contamination, and how many documents they've tried to like bury that kind of sort of like prove. I know I've read a book called Poisoning the Pacific, if anyone's curious. It's by John Mitchell. He's a British journalist based in Japan. He works for Okinawa Times, but he sort of wrote this whole book based on 12,000 plus FOIA documents that shows that the Pentagon buried, you know, a lot of stories of military contamination across the Pacific, hence the title Poisoning the Pacific. But I've always wanted to do like a sort of environmental justice type of deep dive investigative story on that.
Lenica or Katlyn?
I as sort of like a small in the back of my mind like dream project, have always wanted to do something on depictions of hair, and like how and hairstyle and over time and space, and like how what those meant to people who perceived those media, like pictures, videos, drawings, like what you knew about a person based on how their hair was depicted. And it's like funny to say that, meanwhile this like virtual background feature is like really struggling, really grappling with like how to portray my hair. But yeah, it's that's an idea.
I love that.
Thanks, Katlyn. Well, I think this will be our last question with 5 minutes left. Comes from our co-lead for the task force, Lauren Koana. Thanks, Lauren. It says, what kind of Pacific Islander stories or reporting and coverage would you like to see more of from the Continental U.S. newsrooms?
I think I'm just going to echo the same idea about military contamination and military presence in the Pacific Islands. And I guess the growing environmental destruction that's been happening there. I mean, it's been long standing, but I feel like we still need to tell their stories in addition to Indigenous stories and also government and policy stories in those islands.
I feel like I want to see a lot more, or just any coverage, consistent coverage about like decolonization efforts. And I feel like so often when, especially like in the CNMI and stuff, Mariana's Guam, when it is discussed, it is in the context of militarization. And I feel like I would like to see more stories about people who are, yeah, just like leading independence movements, and just that there is a whole other component to these places than is commonly depicted in mainstream media.
I think I would like to see, as far as in particular for Pacific Islanders on the mainland, I'd like to see more coverage of health disparity. I think education is another big one, that anytime the numbers are disaggregated, you see pretty steep disparity in access. But health is, I mean, it's just consistently an issue, pandemic or no pandemic, where Pacific Islanders are often overlooked.
All right, that's all the time we have. I think that was a great note to end on, looking at about the possibilities of what we're able to do with our storytelling, especially as Pacifica journalists. Thank you, Lenica. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Katlyn, for your time. And thank you, everyone else, for joining us. Be on the lookout in the next few weeks. We have part 2 of our series. And in the second panel, we will be talking with Pacific Islander journalists reporting from the Pacific Islands in Oceania. Thank you so much, and have a great week, everyone.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.